My name is Valerie. I am 32 years old, and last week my mother called me crying for the first time in my life. She needs someone to pay off her massive debts and take care of her every single day. Before she even finished asking, I already knew the exact 4 words I was going to say back to her. 2 years ago, I was the one crying in a cold room. A specialist told me that my own immune system was attacking my body, and I needed to go into a sterile isolation ward immediately. My mother answered my panic with a short sentence I will never forget. I spent 6 grueling months in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms, and not one person from my family came to visit. They were too busy planning the grand opening of my younger sister's luxury art restaurant. But they forgot that I know how to read the paperwork. While I was struggling to stand up and learning how to walk again, my mother signed a secret document behind my back. She moved our entire family investment portfolio and all her corporate shares directly into my sister's name. Before that call, my life looked very stable from the outside. I worked as a lead logistics manager for a major shipping corporation in Seattle. My days were filled with customs forms, cargo ships, and international business records. I was good at my job. I usually stayed late because numbers made sense to me, while my family never did. In the shipping business, if a boat arrives late, the company pays a clear financial fine. The rules apply to everyone the exact same way. I owned a small studio apartment near the water, kept an old espresso machine perfectly clean, and always fixed everyone else's problems. I booked my mother's doctor visits. I filled out my sister's tax papers for free every spring. Whenever a crisis happened, the phone always rang on my desk, never the other way around. My friends called me reliable, which is just a nice way of saying I did not know how to say no. I told myself that was a strength. I was the person who read the fine print, the analyst who knew that moving large amounts of money to a child without reporting it could destroy a parent's financial future. I helped clients fix those exact mistakes every day while their relatives stood around looking lost. I never thought I would search a public database and find my own mother's name on a secret transfer form. That afternoon, I sat in my office sorting customs receipts for a large European shipment. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I picked up because I hated leaving things unfinished. A woman told me my name and said the doctor needed to see me the next morning. Doctors do not call you in early to give you good news. I sat at my desk for a long time after she hung up, watching the giant harbor cranes move against the dark gray sky. You need to know how my family worked to understand the rest. My father walked out on us when I was 12. After that, my mother, Miriam, ran our house like a strict prison guard. Money was always tight, and the best things always went to my sister. Felicity is 3 years younger than me. She was always the delicate one who cried easily to get her way. When Felicity wanted to go to an expensive art school, my mother paid for it immediately. When I went to college, I took out student loans. My mother told me that financial hardship builds good character. I worked hard and paid off every cent by the time I turned 30. Meanwhile, Felicity had a degree she never used, a rich fiancé named Arthur, and a restaurant business plan that swallowed more cash every single week. They did not even hide it. Every Sunday, we had a mandatory family dinner. My mother would stand over a chipped porcelain bowl of pot roast and say the same thing every time. Our money belongs to the child, who carries the family name the right way. She always stared right at Felicity when she spoke. You understand why we do this, Valerie. I nodded because I understood perfectly. To my mother, the real family meant wealthy marriages, fancy parties, and perfect pictures. I was just the extra helper. I was the single daughter with a blank calendar, so they assumed I had nothing better to do. My mother thought this was just how the world worked. Her own mother was cared for by an unmarried aunt who gave up her entire life. My mother decided the successful child gets the rewards and the single child handles the emergencies. I heard it so many times that the words just became background noise. But that Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. My mother was about to find out which daughter actually knew how to survive a storm. The next morning, the clinic room felt smaller than it actually was. The doctor didn't waste time with gentle introductions. She laid out my blood panels on the desk, pointed to the fluctuating white cell counts, and explained that my body was essentially fighting its own tissues. The treatment required immediate, aggressive rounds of specialized targeted therapy. Because my immune system would drop to zero during the process, I had to be admitted to a pressurized isolation room within 2 weeks. I didn't break down. Instead, my brain did what it always does when panic starts to creep in. It went straight to logistics. I pulled out my phone and started typing notes as if I were managing a shipment for a client. I asked about the specific drug protocols, the expected number of cycles, and the exact out-of-pocket limits under my corporate health plan. I had analyzed enough international shipping insurance policies to know that the hidden gaps in coverage are exactly where people get financially crushed. The doctor wrote down numbers, and I copied them into my calendar without a single tear. Crying was a luxury that belonged to my sister. My job was simply to build the plan. I walked out to the parking garage, got into my car, and sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy. I stared at the concrete pillars, trying to calculate how a person manages a major medical crisis completely by herself. Despite everything I knew about my family, a small, stubborn part of me still hoped that a life-threatening diagnosis would change things. I unlocked my phone, scrolled down to the contact labeled Mom, and let my thumb hover over the screen. Surely, an autoimmune crisis was the one boundary they wouldn't cross. I wanted to be wrong about them just this once. I pressed the call button. It rang 3 times before my mother picked up. In the background, I could hear loud chatter, the clinking of glasses, and Felicity laughing about fabric samples for restaurant booths. My mother sounded annoyed, asking exactly what I needed because our conversations only happened when there was a task to complete. I spoke clearly and plainly. I told her that my immune system was failing, that I had to enter a hospital isolation ward in 14 days, and that I was terrified to go through it alone. A heavy silence fell over the line. For a few seconds, the only sound was the distant noise of my sister debating interior paint colors. Then my mother sighed, using the exact tone she employed when an unexpected delivery disrupted her schedule. She told me they couldn't focus on this right now. She explained that Felicity was in the middle of securing the final licenses for the Arch restaurant. I waited for her to add that they would make time, or that she would drive me to the hospital, or even just that she was sorry. Instead, she filled the space with complaints about contractors, permits, and how stressed my sister was about the upcoming launch. She told me I had always been the resilient sibling, and that I would manage just fine without anyone hovering over me. Before I could even process the words, she lowered her voice and told me not to stress Felicity with my news. She said my sister was far too fragile to handle this kind of anxiety right now. "Okay," I said. That is the detail that still haunts me when I look back. I said it in my normal, professional voice, as if she had simply asked me to check a shipping manifest. We hung up the phone. I sat in the dim garage and realized completely that there was no safety net. My life had simply caused an inconvenience on a date when they were busy with something else. I stopped expecting them to show up, but I started paying very close attention to how they operated. 2 days later, I tried reaching out in a different direction. I sent a short, careful text to Felicity. I laid out the medical details and asked if she could at least sit with me in the admissions lobby on the morning I checked into the isolation unit, just so I wouldn't have to walk under the sterile lights entirely by myself. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear on my screen for nearly an hour. When her reply finally arrived, it was a massive wall of text detailing her restaurant's menu design, followed by a sentence that felt like a punch to the chest. She wrote that since I didn't have a partner or children to take care of, I had all the time in the world to deal with medical appointments, whereas her own schedule was completely packed with real responsibilities. I read the text multiple times, searching for some hint of empathy, but the words remained exactly as she wrote them. To my sister, my independence wasn't a personal choice. It was an unallocated resource that gave the family permission to ignore me. My empty home meant my time was worthless, while her busy calendar was completely sacred. When I called my mother, hoping she would correct Felicity's cruelty, she defended her immediately. She told me it wasn't as if I had a husband waiting for me at home, and that Felicity genuinely needed every bit of emotional backing the family could offer right now. I set the phone face down on my wooden table. The apartment felt completely quiet, the way a building feels after the electricity suddenly cuts out. I stopped asking. I knew right then that if I needed help to survive the coming months, I would have to find it somewhere far away from the people who shared my DNA. The morning of my admission arrived with a gray drizzle that blurred the Seattle skyline. I drove myself to the medical center, parked in the underground lot, and carried a single duffel bag toward the elevators. The isolation ward was located on the 9th floor behind a set of double glass doors equipped with heavy airlocks. The nurses checked my identity bands, drew 3 tubes of blood, and guided me into a stark, pressurized room. A large warning sign on the door strictly prohibited visitors without specialized protective gear. The head nurse noticed my empty hands and the lack of anyone standing behind me in the doorway. She returned a few minutes later with a thick, quilted cotton throw blanket and draped it over the rigid vinyl armchair in the corner. The blanket was dyed a deep forest green, faded from dozens of commercial laundry cycles and frayed along the binding. It wasn't soft, and it certainly wasn't elegant, but it represented the only deliberate act of comfort offered to me in that building. I wrapped it tightly around my shoulders to combat the chill of the air filtration system. I opened my laptop immediately. I needed the familiar rhythm of work to drown out the steady, mechanical hum of the air valves. For the first 4 hours, I systematically audited shipping logs and calculated fuel surcharges for a cargo vessel bound for Tokyo, while the first round of targeted medications trickled into my veins through a central line. Around me, through the thick glass observation panels, I watched the routines of the other rooms. In the adjacent bay, an elderly man played cards with his adult son. Across the hall, a young woman leaned her head against her partner's shoulder while they watched a movie on a shared tablet. Out of 12 operational isolation pods on the floor, 11 rooms contained active support systems made of human beings. My room contained a laptop, a stack of electronic manifests, and a faded green blanket. When the primary medication bag finished emptying, the floor nurse entered to check my vitals. She asked who would be handling my discharge and picking up my prescriptions at the end of the week. I looked her in the eye and told her I had arranged a private medical transport service, masking the reality that I simply intended to call an ordinary rideshare app and walk to the curb alone. I drove home 6 days later with my hands trembling violently on the steering wheel. The radio turned completely off so I could concentrate on keeping the vehicle between the white lines. My family's mandatory Sunday dinners proceeded without interruption. The family group chat remained highly active, though I muted the notifications to preserve my sanity. Every Monday morning, I woke up to digital images of the chipped porcelain bowl sitting on the kitchen island, surrounded by relatives laughing and raising glasses. The captions always read the same way. "Thinking of you, Valerie." Yet, the digital messages never materialized into an actual text asking if I needed groceries, an offer to drop off a hot meal, or a single phone call to check on my blood counts. The family machinery had simply adjusted its perimeter, closing the gap where my seat used to be so that the view of the landscape remained completely unmarred by my illness. By the 3rd month of treatment, the financial reality of the crisis arrived in plain white envelopes. Even with excellent corporate coverage, the out-of-pocket costs for specialized isolation care and targeted biological drugs accumulated rapidly. The total balance reached $46,000. I liquidated my modest index funds, canceled every non-essential monthly service, shifted my diet to basic pantry staples, and set up a strict 5-year installment plan with the hospital's billing department. When the financial pressure peaked during a particularly rough week of physical fatigue, I broke my own rule. I called my mother to ask if she could provide a temporary loan of $5,000 to cover a medical deductible until my company's health reimbursement account processed my paperwork. Her response was instantaneous and entirely devoid of hesitation. She informed me that she had just transferred the final structural deposit to the general contractors handling the kitchen installation for Felicity's Arch Restaurant. She stated flatly that the family accounts held absolutely no surplus funds, and then she added that I had always been remarkably resourceful at handling my own finances. I didn't argue, nor did I attempt to explain the severity of the collection notices. I simply hung up the phone and filed the interaction away in the analytical part of my brain. The hierarchy was now entirely documented. A cosmetic restaurant renovation took absolute priority, while my physical survival didn't even make the ledger. The hospital routine changed in November during my 4th week of treatment. The nurse steered an elderly woman toward the empty armchair next to mine. She wore a bright yellow hen-knit cap over her smooth, bald head and carried a massive stainless steel thermos under her arm. She adjusted her reading glasses, watched me pull up 3 shipping spreadsheets on my laptop, and sighed. "The nurses should forbid computers during a medical infusion," she said, her voice carrying the sharp, clear tone of a retired schoolteacher. "It creates a terrible habit of working while being poisoned." I let out a genuine laugh for the first time in months. Her name was Martha, a retired nurse who spent her retirement volunteering at the hospital. She began intentionally coordinating her therapy sessions to match my schedule. She brought 2 small ceramic cups every Thursday so we could share the contents of her thermos. It always contained a pungent, homemade ginger and peppermint tea that settled my stomach far better than the synthetic anti-nausea pills from the pharmacy. Martha had been a widow for nearly a decade. Her only son lived in a different time zone and only called on major holidays. Instead of becoming bitter, she had simply decided that loneliness was a practical problem she could solve by adopting whoever happened to sit in the adjacent clinic chair. One freezing afternoon, as the snow began to mix with the rain outside the glass, Martha watched me shut down my computer. "Who is waiting downstairs to drive you back to your apartment?" she asked plainly. I gave my standard response, telling her I had a reliable transport service lined up. Martha fixed me with a knowing look, the exact expression of an experienced educator who had caught a student skipping an assignment. "Family is not a matter of bloodlines or legal certificates," Martha said, stirring her tea with a small metal spoon. "It is simply the people who keep showing up when the room gets cold. The rest is just paperwork." The word paperwork echoed in my head. That was my entire career. Instead of arguing, I closed my bag and let her guide me toward the exit. It was the first time someone else took the keys. I sat in her warm passenger seat, watched the windshield wipers clear the sleet, and felt a strange, unfamiliar weight lift from my shoulders. I was no longer the person required to be in charge of the crisis. The grand opening of Felicity's Arch Restaurant occurred exactly on schedule without my presence. I viewed the entire event secondhand through social media feeds, watching the updates roll in while resting on my townhouse sofa. My mother posted a series of photographs showing the extended family gathered under the custom lighting fixtures. In the center stood Felicity, glowing in a silk dress, alongside Arthur. My mother had captioned the main image, the proudest night of our lives, surrounded by the people who matter most. I looked at the glowing screen once, closed the application, and opened a file of international maritime regulations. The numbers and rules on the page were completely indifferent to family dynamics. They operated on logic, and that was exactly what I needed. Later that week, my supervising director at the shipping firm handed me a complex audit assignment. The project involved reviewing international shipping registries and private asset holding companies that used container ports to move wealth across borders. The regulatory training was intense. I learned about the strict look-back periods the government uses to track hidden wealth, the heavy tax penalties applied to unrecorded asset transfers, and the exact formulas used to calculate financial evasion. I realized that when an individual moves a valuable asset behind closed doors to avoid future liabilities, the system doesn't protect them. It creates a massive legal trap that can sink their entire financial standing. I memorized every line of the tax code and filed the information away in my mind. I never imagined I would eventually use those exact regulations to audit my own mother. The 4th month of treatment brought a new kind of exhaustion. The biological drugs drained my energy so completely that even holding a pen felt like lifting a lead bar. I spent my days in a quiet rhythm, moving between my bed and the living room sofa, wrapped in the faded green hospital blanket. By the time December arrived, the stack of medical bills on my kitchen counter had grown into a mountain. The total out-of-pocket balance after insurance stood at exactly $46,000. Every morning, I sat down with a calculator, trying to balance my regular rent, electricity, and groceries against the aggressive payment plan the hospital demanded. I cut my expenses down to the absolute bare minimum, canceling my internet service, dropping my phone plan to the cheapest tier, and surviving on rice, beans, and canned broth. During the third week of the month, the hospital's billing department sent a final notice regarding a $5,000 deductible that had to be paid before January 1st to keep the payment plan active. My checking account was entirely empty. Left with no other choice, I swallowed my pride, picked up the phone, and called my mother. Miriam answered on the second ring, her voice loud and hurried over the sound of clinking silverware. I didn't beat around the bush. I told her plainly that I owed $5,000 for my medical care, that my bank account was cleared out, and asked if she could loan me the amount for just 2 months until my company processed my health reimbursement. "Valerie, please," Miriam sighed, her tone shifting into a sharp, irritated lecture. "We just transferred the final structural deposit to the general contractors for Felicity's Arch Restaurant kitchen. The family accounts are completely tapped out. You earn a steady salary and you don't have a family to support. You have always been the resourceful one, so you will just have to figure this out on your own." The line went quiet. I didn't argue, nor did I explain that I was skipping meals to afford my medication. I simply hung up the phone. I sat at the table and stared at the white wall. The reality was now written in stone. A cosmetic renovation for a gallery kitchen was a priority, while my actual survival didn't even register as an emergency. I opened my professional ledger, crossed out my mother's name as a contact, and filed the conversation away in the cold, analytical part of my brain where I kept my shipping data. It wasn't an emotional problem anymore, it was just a mathematical fact. The snow fell thick over Seattle by the middle of January, burying the harbor docks in white. My treatment was finally starting to work, but the physical toll left me pale, thin, and noticeably fragile. I wore a soft knit cap to cover my patchy hair and moved slowly around my apartment, counting the days until my numbers stabilized. The phone rang on a Thursday evening while I was making hot water for tea. My mother's voice was bright and full of energy, a complete contrast to the quiet of my kitchen. She didn't ask how my latest lab results looked or if I was able to keep food down. Instead, she launched into a detailed description of the grand opening party for Felicity's Arch Restaurant, which was happening the following weekend. Mainstream local food critics and city reporters were already confirmed to attend. Then, her tone shifted into something careful and rehearsed. "Valerie, dear, we've been thinking about the guest list," Miriam said, her voice dropping to a smooth, reasonable purr. "The local press will be taking photographs all night, and the lighting is very harsh. You look so incredibly drained right now. We really think it's best if you sit this one out. We don't want anything to pull attention away from Felicity's big moment or make the investors ask questions about why you look so unwell." I stood by the counter, holding the telephone receiver tightly against my ear. "You want me to stay home because of how I look," I said, keeping my voice completely flat. "It's just about the photographs, honey," Miriam replied quickly, as if she were explaining an obvious business decision. "They last forever. You've always been the strong one anyway, so you don't need to be there to know we love you. Let's just keep the focus where it belongs." I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. My skin looked gray, and my clothes hung loosely on my frame from the weight loss. "Okay," I said. I hung up before she could say goodbye. I didn't cry, which surprised me. The old hurt had burned out, leaving behind a cold, clear space. In my family's world, my illness was simply a design flaw that threatened to ruin the aesthetic of their perfect evening. I walked over to my desk, pulled out a fresh manila folder, and labeled it with my family's names. I was done volunteering to be part of a family that only valued me when I was invisible. Spring finally arrived, and my strength started coming back. I was back at my desk full-time, managing cargo insurance claims for the shipping company. The predictable routine of checking insurance policies and approving payouts gave me a sense of peace after months of hospital rooms. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, I needed to look up an old tax identification number for a regular shipping client. I logged into a secure digital cloud drive that I had set up for my mother years ago to help her store her medical receipts and tax forms. I rarely logged into it anymore, but I knew the password was saved on my work computer. As I searched for the client's file, I noticed a new notification icon flashing in the corner of the shared folder. A brand new document had been uploaded to the drive just 3 months earlier, right around the time I was fighting for my life in the isolation ward. The file name was simple: Final Transfer Signed, PDF. Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the link and opened the document. It was not a medical receipt. It was a formal contract from a private bank. My mother had taken her entire lifetime investment bond, worth $400,000, and legally given it to my sister, Felicity. The paper showed that Felicity paid exactly $5 to buy the entire fund. The transaction was stamped and finalized while I was sitting alone in a hospital chair, trying to figure out how to pay my own medical bills. I sat completely still at my desk, staring at the glowing monitor. My family had quietly wiped out every cent of my mother's personal wealth behind my back, but as I stared at the signatures, my professional training kicked in and I noticed something else. They had tried to hide the money, but they had actually created a massive financial trap. Because I handle insurance risks for a living, I know the laws about large financial gifts. Moving a massive investment fund to a relative for practically no money triggers immediate tax penalties. Even worse, it completely disqualifies a person from receiving emergency government aid or medical assistance for years. My mother thought she was protecting her favorite daughter, but she had actually left herself completely exposed to financial ruin. I quietly downloaded the file, saved it to my private desktop, and closed the cloud drive. The file sat on my computer screen, its dark blue banking seal looking official and cold. I printed a physical copy just to feel the reality of the paper between my fingers. The ink was still warm from the machine as I laid it across my desk. My sister's signature looked smooth and flowing, decorated with a tiny heart over the letter I. She had signed it on the exact day I was counting the ceiling tiles in the emergency room, trying to stay calm. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a black pen. I did not want to look at the document as a daughter anymore. I needed to look at it as an insurance auditor. My family had treated the family bond like a secret stash of cash they could just pass across the dinner table. They did not realize that the financial system keeps a permanent record of everything. The math was devastating. By giving away $400,000 for a single $5 bill, my mother had triggered a massive IRS gift tax violation. Even worse, our state laws have a strict look-back window for anyone applying for state-funded medical aid or emergency housing assistance. If an elderly person gives away their wealth for free within that window, the government calculates a massive penalty period. I wrote the numbers down on the pad. I took the total value of the fund and divided it by the average monthly cost of professional long-term care. The result stared back at me in bold ink: 34 months. For nearly 3 full years, the state would refuse to pay a single dime for my mother's health crises or nursing costs. The law would expect Felicity to use the transferred wealth to pay those bills. I felt a sudden, strange sense of relief wash over me. The pain of being left out did not disappear, but it changed into something manageable. They thought they had successfully pushed me out of the family circle and secured their future. In reality, they had just handed each other a ticking financial bomb, and I was the only person who knew how to read the countdown timer. I quietly slid the papers into my desk drawer, locked it, and went back to my regular afternoon tasks. 2 years passed like a quiet stream. My health returned completely, and my hair grew back thick and dark. I spent my mornings running along the waterfront and my evenings learning how to cook complex, nourishing meals. I earned a promotion to senior risk analyst at the shipping firm. My life was full, stable, and completely hidden from my relatives. I kept my phone on silent during weekends and only exchanged formal text messages with my mother on major holidays. I had completely moved on from the ghost of their rejection. Then, on a hot Thursday evening in July, everything broke. I was in my kitchen, chopping fresh herbs for a dinner with Martha, when my phone lit up on the counter. The caller ID showed my mother's name. A strange weight dropped into my stomach as I picked it up. Miriam did not start with a greeting. She was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, her voice sounding incredibly weak and frightened. Through the tears, she explained that she had suffered a severe health crisis 10 days ago that left the left side of her body completely weak. She could no longer manage stairs, she could not dress herself, and she needed constant daily care. But that was only half the emergency. That morning, a formal state auditor had knocked on her door. The state tax authority had flags on the shared digital cloud drive and her bank records. They discovered the unrecorded $400,000 transfer she had made to Felicity. Because the gift broke the look-back laws, the state officially froze her accounts and denied her application for emergency medical assistance. She was completely broke, physically helpless, and facing immediate legal penalties. "Valerie, you have to help me," she wept into the phone. "The bills are mounting already. Felicity is completely overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do." I stood by my counter, holding the knife, watching the evening sun hit the kitchen tiles. My mother spoke for 10 minutes, but not once did she ask how my own health was, or if my immune system had stayed strong over the last 2 years. In her mind, I was still the utility worker, the single daughter who lived on a shelf until the real family ran into trouble. "I will look into the matter," I said quietly. I hung up and called Martha to cancel dinner. The countdown timer on the bomb they had built had finally reached 0, and the smoke was heading right for my door. The family network moved with sudden speed the next morning. My phone buzzed at exactly 8 o'clock with a call from Felicity. Her voice did not carry any of the soft, delicate tones she usually used to get her way. She sounded sharp, stressed, and completely transactional. "I already talked to Mom," Felicity said, skipping any kind of greeting. "We looked at the numbers, and this is the only plan that makes sense. Since you work from your apartment half the time, you need to pack up your things and move into Mom's place by the end of the month to take care of her." I leaned back in my office chair, watching a cargo ship pull out of the harbor window. "And why exactly is that the only plan, Felicity?" "Because you don't have a real family to worry about, Valerie," she said, her voice rising in irritation. "You don't have a husband or a baby. My restaurant is in a critical growth phase, and Lawrence and I cannot just pause our entire lives. You have the flexibility. It is just a logical sacrifice." The sheer nerve of her statement hung in the air. 2 years ago, my single status meant my time was completely worthless, and I was left to face a life-threatening illness alone. Now, that exact same single status made me the perfect candidate to act as a full-time, unpaid nurse. Before I could answer, the line clicked, and Uncle Arthur joined the call. In our family, Uncle Arthur was the enforcer, the relative who always appeared to talk about honor and blood obligation whenever someone refused to comply with the group's demands. "A good, devoted daughter would not even hesitate, Valerie," Arthur said, using his deep, lecturing voice. "Your mother gave you life. Now she is sick and facing financial ruin. It is your moral duty to step up, take out a personal crisis loan to clear those state penalties, and fix this situation." I listened to them talk for another 5 minutes, sketching notes on my legal pad. They laid out the entire schedule for my life as if they owned it. But throughout the entire conversation, I noticed the one massive thing they completely left out. Neither of them mentioned the $400,000 investment fund. They were talking about duty and sacrifice, but they had no idea that I already held the copy of the secret contract they had signed in the dark. "I will see you at the family gathering this Sunday," I said flatly, and hung up the phone before they could celebrate their victory. The dining room inside Felicity's new suburban house looked like a page from an expensive design magazine. The walls were covered in a light olive color, and the large kitchen behind it featured smooth walnut cabinets that perfectly caught the overhead lighting. My mother sat at the far end of the long wooden table in a specialized chair, her left arm resting heavily in her lap, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Felicity and Uncle Arthur sat opposite me, their faces grim and expectant. The main course sat untouched in the center of the table. Uncle Arthur didn't even wait for water to be poured before he pushed a thick stack of loan applications and legal power of attorney documents across the wood toward me. "We need your signature on these today, Valerie," Arthur said, tapping his finger on the top page. "The state authority is moving fast. This bank loan will cover the immediate tax penalties, and the power of attorney will let you handle the sale of your mother's remaining personal items to stabilize the situation. It's time to show this family what you're made of." Felicity nodded, leaning forward. "We've already cleaned out a spare bedroom for you at Mom's place. You can move your home office setup there by Friday. It's really the only logical way forward for everyone." I looked at the documents, then up at my mother, who avoided my gaze, looking down at her lap instead. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I unzipped my briefcase, pulled out a single, thin manila folder, and laid it flat on the table directly over the loan applications. "I brought my own paperwork," I said, my voice completely calm and clear. Felicity frowned, reaching out to pull the folder toward her. She opened it, and I watched the color drain completely from her face as she saw the bright blue banking seal and the title, "Final Transfer Signed, PDF." "What is this?" Arthur demanded, looking between us. "That is the document showing that while I was fighting for my life in an isolation ward 2 years ago, Miriam legally gave away her entire $400,000 investment bond to Felicity for the price of $5, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on my sister. "You both talked a lot about duty, honor, and sacrifice on the phone, but neither of you mentioned that Felicity is currently sitting on nearly $500,000 of family wealth. That money is for the restaurant's future expansion," Felicity snapped, her voice suddenly high and panicked. "It's tied up in assets. We can't just liquidizing it to pay state fines." "Then the restaurant will have to fail," I replied flatly. "Because I am not taking out a single dollar in loans, and I am not moving into anyone's house to act as an unpaid nurse." My mother finally looked up, her eyes wide and wet with tears. "Valerie, please. I'm your mother. You can't just leave me like this. You're the strong one. 2 years ago, you told me that my independence meant I could handle a life-threatening illness all by myself because I didn't have a real family to worry about," I said, standing up from the table and zipping my briefcase. "You chose who mattered, and you chose who got the rewards. Now, the law says the person who got the rewards has to pay the penalties. Talk to a defense attorney because I am officially removing myself from the ledger." I turned and walked toward the front door, the heavy silence of the room following me out into the cool evening air. The drive back to the waterfront was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. The city lights reflected off the dark surface of the bay, and the cool Pacific air coming through the open window felt clean. For the first time in 32 years, the heavy, invisible anchor I had been carrying behind me was completely gone. When I unlocked the door to my studio apartment, the space felt different. It was no longer a lonely refuge where I hid away to heal from rejection. It was entirely my own kingdom. The professional espresso machine sat on the counter, catching the soft light from the street lamps. My laptop lay closed on the desk. 10 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate violently with incoming notifications. I didn't even lift it to read the text preview blocks. I knew exactly what they contained: panicked accusations from Uncle Arthur, desperate pleas from my mother, and furious walls of text from Felicity as the reality of the state tax investigation settled over their household. I systematically tapped the settings menu, selected each of their profiles, and pressed block. The digital screen immediately went entirely blank. Instead of logging into my work dashboard, I opened my personal streaming software. I adjusted the external microphone, checked the camera frame, and started the recording for the final segment of the video story. The hardest part of walking away from a toxic dynamic isn't the anger. I spoke directly into the lens, my voice steady and completely at peace. It is the moment you realize that the cage door was actually unlocked the entire time. You don't owe your life to people who only remember your name when their own ship is sinking. True family isn't determined by a shared registry or a birth certificate. It is built by the people who stay in the cold room with you when everyone else leaves. I paused, looking at the recording indicator. I hit the stop button, uploaded the file to the processing queue, and shut the lid of the computer. The next morning, the sun broke bright and clear over the Seattle harbor. I walked down to the local pier where Martha was already waiting at our usual corner table, 2 steaming ceramic mugs of peppermint tea sitting between the chairs. She didn't ask about the dinner or the documents. She simply pushed a hot mug toward my hand and smiled. I took a sip, looked out at the cargo ships moving smoothly across the open water, and smiled back. The storm had completely passed, and my life was finally moving forward exactly on schedule. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have signed those papers to save your mother from financial ruin, or would you have walked away just like I did? How would you deal with a family that only remembers you exist when they need a sacrifice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think about this story, and I read every single comment. If this story resonated with you, please hit the subscribe button. It is incredibly important to me and helps grow our community here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.